Welcome to Storytime with Shelley. Get ready for a journey through gripping, emotional, and thought-provoking stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Every tale has a twist, and every character hides a secret. Let's dive in. Keanu stood outside the sleek, modern car dealership, staring at the shiny new cars that lined the showroom. His eyes, often a window to his deeper emotions, betrayed a sense of calmness that masked an underlying tension. Today wasn't just about buying a new car, it was about reclaiming a part of his past, an opportunity that had slipped away years ago. The dealership had no idea what they were about to witness. Inside, the dealership manager, a sharp-suited man named Robert, was busy with a high-stakes sale to a group of young executives. He was proud of his reputation, untouchable, unyielding. His clients came first, and he didn't tolerate any interruptions, especially from people who didn't seem to belong. Keanu, with his unkempt hair and worn jacket, didn't look like the kind of person who could afford the luxury cars parked inside. As Keanu stepped through the door, Robert barely glanced up from his paperwork. "Can I help you?" he asked dismissively, not even bothering to hide his contempt. "I'm just looking," Keanu replied quietly, his voice calm, but there was something in it that seemed to hold a story, a silent force that Robert couldn't quite place. Keanu wandered through the rows of cars, touching the polished surfaces, the scent of fresh leather filling the air. His eyes briefly locked with a salesman who tried to engage him, but Robert was already on the move, sensing an inconvenience to his business. "You can't just wander around here. If you're not buying, I suggest you leave," Robert said, now standing directly in front of Keanu. His voice was sharp, harsh. Keanu met his gaze without hesitation, his eyes steady, unfazed. "I'm just taking my time," he said. But Robert wasn't interested in waiting. "This is a place for serious customers. If you don't plan on purchasing, I suggest you leave immediately." His tone was cold, final. He had dealt with people like Keanu before, people who didn't belong in his world of luxury and business. Keanu paused for a moment, taking in Robert's arrogance, then quietly walked towards the exit. Robert watched him, satisfied that his quick judgment had driven the unwanted guest away. But as Keanu reached the door, he turned around and made a brief phone call. Robert didn't think much of it, his attention already back on the deal he was closing with the executives. Minutes later, the door opened again, this time with a sense of urgency. The receptionist entered, her face pale. "Mr. Robert," she said, voice trembling. "There's someone here to see you." Robert looked up, annoyed. "Tell them I'm busy." "But sir, it's the owner." "The owner of what?" Robert's eyes narrowed, his thoughts racing. He didn't know of any big clients he was expecting. The door opened, and Keanu stepped back inside. This time, the air shifted. Robert stood frozen, his usual confidence slipping away. "Mr. Robert," Keanu said, his voice now carrying an unmistakable authority. "I think we need to talk." Robert blinked, confusion flickering across his face. You're the owner?" he asked, his voice betraying his disbelief. Keanu smiled, the faintest glimmer of a challenge in his eyes. "Yes, I am," Keanu replied calmly. "I own this dealership." A silence fell between them, thick with the weight of Robert's arrogance crumbling before Keanu's quiet presence. The young executives, who had been watching the exchange with interest, now turned their attention to the unfolding drama. Keanu's words weren't just a revelation, they were a challenge. The manager, who had treated him like an outsider, now found himself on the other side of power. The realization was a bitter one. The car dealership that Robert had so carefully curated for the elite was no longer his kingdom to rule. Keanu's calm expression softened just slightly as he glanced at the executives. "I think you should leave now," he said to them, his voice carrying a weight that was impossible to ignore. "This business needs a new direction." Keanu stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of the room shift. The executives, once so self-assured, now seemed unsure, glancing at each other as if searching for answers they didn't have. Robert's face had turned pale, the arrogance now completely gone, replaced by confusion and fear. Keanu had dismantled his carefully constructed world with just a few words, and the sudden power shift was evident in every corner of the room. "Wait," Robert's voice finally cracked, trying to regain control. "You can't just walk in here and..." Keanu raised a hand, cutting him off. "I'm not here to explain myself to you. But I am here to make changes," he said, his voice firm but calm. "I've been watching, listening, and I know what's been happening here." Robert's eyes darted around nervously. He had no idea what Keanu was implying, but he knew enough to sense the danger in the air. Keanu wasn't just a figurehead, he was a force. And now, Robert was at his mercy. The executives, still processing the reality of the situation, began to shuffle uncomfortably. One of them, a young woman in her late 20s, finally spoke up. "But, Mr. Reeves, we were told that the owner was, well, a group of investors. There was no mention of you." Keanu smiled faintly. "There was no mention of me because I chose to stay behind the scenes. But that's about to change. The truth is, I've been involved with this business for years. I've seen the manipulation, the games being played, the way the staff is treated like they're expendable." The words hit harder than any physical blow. Robert's face flushed red, his arrogance quickly turning into panic as Keanu continued to speak. "You've built an empire on the backs of people who've been lied to, worked to the bone, and disrespected," Keanu said, his eyes narrowing. "And I've seen enough. This place, and the way it's been run, is going to change." The executives looked between each other, unsure of how to react. This wasn't the smooth-talking businessman they were used to dealing with. This was a man who saw through the facade and wasn't afraid to tear it down. Robert opened his mouth to argue, but Keanu was already walking toward the back office, gesturing for the receptionist to follow him. "You all stay here, I'm going to take a moment to review some things," he said without looking back. Robert stood rooted to the spot, completely dumbfounded. The executives, unsure of how to handle the situation, did nothing but stand awkwardly. Keanu had just completely shifted the power dynamic. The dealership they thought they knew was no longer the place they thought it was. Inside the office, Keanu stood by the large window, gazing out at the lot. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the cars below. But his mind was elsewhere, focused on the bigger picture, how he would reshape this place, and more importantly, how he would show the world that power and status weren't always what they seemed. The truth, as it turned out, was far more complicated, and far more empowering. As he looked at the view below, Keanu couldn't help but think about the many people who had been treated as lesser, all while the powerful thrived. The executives were just the surface. The real work, the real change, lay in the heart of the business, its workers, its values, its integrity. A knock at the door pulled him out of his thoughts. It was the receptionist, her face still pale. "Mr. Reeves, there's someone here to see you." Keanu turned, his expression unreadable. "Who?" The receptionist hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "It's Mr. Clayton. He says he's with the board of directors." Keanu's eyes narrowed. "Send him in," he said, his voice steady. The game was only just beginning. The door opened slowly, and in walked a man dressed in a sharp black suit, his expression stoic and cold. Mr. Clayton, the head of the board of directors, was a tall figure, with a commanding presence that seemed to fill the room. He had heard the rumors about Keanu's involvement with the dealership, but he hadn't believed them until now. Standing face to face with him, he knew that this would be a confrontation that would change everything. "Mr. Reeves," Clayton began, his voice as controlled as his demeanor, "I've heard what you've done here today. And I'm going to be blunt, this isn't how things are done. You have no business disrupting the flow of operations." Keanu studied him carefully, his eyes sharp and calculating. "The flow of operations? You mean the same operations that exploit workers, deceive customers, and prioritize profits over integrity?" he said, his voice steady but carrying an undeniable weight. "You think I'm here to play by your rules. But I'm not. I'm here to change the game." Clayton smirked, clearly unimpressed. "You're playing with fire, Mr. Reeves. You may own the place now, but there's a reason why I've been running things the way I have. You think people care about ethics in business? They care about results, power, and money." Keanu's eyes narrowed as he took a step closer, his presence looming in the room. "And what happens when those results come at the cost of everything else? When power is wielded to crush others, and money becomes the only measure of success? Is that really the kind of world you want to live in?" He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Because it's not the kind of world I want to create." Clayton's expression faltered for a brief moment. There was something about Keanu's quiet intensity, his belief in something deeper than the pursuit of wealth, that rattled him. He had seen countless people come and go in his career, all chasing the same things: status, wealth, power. But Keanu wasn't like them. There was a sincerity in his eyes, a conviction that Clayton couldn't quite understand. "You're naive, Mr. Reeves," Clayton said, trying to regain control of the situation. You think you can just waltz in here and change things overnight? People like me have built empires, while people like you play in the margins. Your little dream won't survive in the real world. Keanu remained calm, unfazed by Clayton's words. Maybe it's time someone tried to make that dream real, he said, his voice resolute. Maybe it's time we stop pretending that everything is fine while people are suffering. I'm not here to survive, Clayton. I'm here to make something better, something real. The tension in the room grew thick as Keanu's words hung in the air. Clayton looked like he was about to speak, but before he could, Keanu turned his back to him, walking slowly toward the large desk in the corner of the office. He picked up a photo frame from the desk, an old picture of a younger Keanu with his family. He glanced at it for a moment before setting it down gently. I don't do this for power or recognition, Keanu said, his voice softer now. I do this for the people who've been overlooked, for the ones who are told they don't matter. Because they do. And if this business is going to thrive, it has to do so with honor, respect, and a sense of responsibility. Clayton stood in stunned silence. The man before him wasn't the reckless newcomer he had assumed. He wasn't just fighting for control, he was fighting for something much bigger. The realization hit Clayton like a cold splash of water. Keanu turned to face him once more, his gaze unwavering. You have a choice, Clayton. You can either adapt to what's coming, or you can watch as everything you've built falls apart. I'm not afraid of the consequences. But if you're smart, you'll understand that this isn't just a battle over power, it's a battle over what kind of world we want to live in. The silence that followed was deafening. Clayton stood there, no longer sure of himself, no longer certain that he could control the outcome. He had underestimated Keanu, and now it was clear, this wasn't just about business. It was about a fight for the soul of the company, for the future of the people who worked here, and for the values that Keanu was willing to stake everything on. Finally, Clayton spoke, his voice low and grudging. You think you can change things? Fine, but remember, you've got a long road ahead. Keanu's lips curved into a faint smile. I'm used to long roads, he said quietly. And I never walk them alone. As Clayton turned to leave, Keanu stayed behind, looking out of the window once again. The light outside had begun to fade, but he knew one thing for certain, the real battle was just beginning. And this time, it wouldn't just be about winning. It would be about proving that doing the right thing was worth every sacrifice. The days that followed were filled with tension. Keanu's quiet resolve shook the very foundations of the dealership. Employees who had kept their heads down, too afraid to speak up, now found themselves emboldened by the changes he was making. Keanu wasn't just sitting in his office making decisions from a distance, he was walking through the floor, talking to the staff, listening to their stories, their struggles, their hopes. It was clear that this wasn't a publicity stunt, Keanu was genuinely invested in making a difference. Robert, still reeling from the earlier confrontation, had tried to salvage what little pride he had left, but his authority was rapidly diminishing. Keanu's presence loomed over him, and every decision he made seemed to be under constant scrutiny. The once unshakable manager now found himself questioning his every move. One afternoon, as Keanu was meeting with a group of employees in the break room, Robert approached hesitantly. His face was a mix of frustration and fear, as if he had finally realized just how deep Keanu's influence ran. You're making a mistake, Robert said, standing in the doorway. You're not going to win over anyone with this nonsense. People don't want change. They want things to stay the same, to stay comfortable. Keanu looked up from his conversation, his eyes meeting Robert's with an intensity that made him take a step back. Comfort, is that what you think this is about? Keanu's voice was calm, but the words carried a weight that made Robert pause. Comfort doesn't change anything. Comfort keeps people stagnant. It keeps them complacent. I'm not here to comfort anyone, Robert. I'm here to make this place better. For everyone. Robert opened his mouth to argue, but something in Keanu's words hit him deeper than he was willing to admit. The words echoed in his mind, challenging his entire way of thinking, his whole life of climbing the corporate ladder without caring who was trampled beneath it. He hadn't realized just how much he had lost touch with what mattered, until now. Before Robert could respond, one of the employees, a young woman named Sarah, stood up from the table. Mr. Reeves is right, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. We've all been treated like we're disposable. I've been here for over 5 years, and every day it feels like I'm just a cog in a machine. You didn't care about us, Robert. You only cared about your numbers. Robert's face twisted, a mixture of anger and shame flooding his features. He opened his mouth to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. It was as if, for the first time, he truly understood what had been happening all along. The realization was painful, and he didn't know how to face it. Keanu stood up, walking over to the group of employees. He met Sarah's gaze and nodded. You're right, this isn't just about making this company profitable. This is about making it a place where people are respected, where they feel like they matter. He turned to Robert, who was standing silently in the doorway, unable to respond. You've built an empire on the backs of people who've had no voice, Robert. And now it's time to listen. The words hit Robert like a slap in the face. For a moment, he just stood there, the reality of everything Keanu had said crashing down on him. He had spent years working under the illusion that power was his to command, that his decisions were justified because they brought in profits. But now, standing here in the midst of his employees, he saw the truth. The system he had perpetuated wasn't sustainable. It wasn't real power. It was just control, built on fear and exploitation. Maybe it's time I stepped back, Robert muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. He turned and left the room, his shoulders slumped in defeat. It was a rare moment of self-awareness that he had never experienced before. The man who had once been untouchable now found himself questioning his own role in the world he had so carefully built. As Robert exited, Keanu remained with the employees, who now seemed to feel a new sense of empowerment. They were no longer afraid to speak up, no longer worried about their jobs. The tide had begun to turn, and they could feel it. Keanu's approach wasn't about controlling them, it was about elevating them, giving them the chance to take ownership of their own destinies. Later that evening, as the dealership closed, Keanu stood by the front window, watching the last of the employees head out into the night. The world outside was quiet, but inside, there was a sense of quiet revolution. The changes had only just begun, but the impact was already being felt. His phone buzzed in his pocket, interrupting his thoughts. It was a message from an unknown number. Mr. Reeves, you don't know me, but I think you should be aware of something. There's more to this dealership than you realize. You've stirred something up, and it's about to get ugly. Keanu's eyes narrowed as he read the message, his mind racing. He knew there was more to this than just a managerial shift. The people who had been hiding in the shadows, pulling strings from behind the scenes, were about to make their move. But Keanu wasn't afraid. He had started something, and he wasn't about to back down now.